first lesson from the book of Genesis today reminds us yet again that the world was different in many ways 4,000 years ago. That's more or less when we figure that Abraham and Sarah lived. We figure that they probably lived around the year 2000 BC, so 4,000 years ago. And our lessons describe a covenant ceremony in which, as I was talking with the kids, God and Abraham and Sarah make a promise to each other, but the way they went about that ceremony is a lot different than the ceremonies that we celebrate here on Sunday mornings. One day, God comes to Abram and his wife Sarah and says to them, let's make a promise to each other. What I promise to you, says God, is I promise to bless you, to bring you to a land that is prosperous and good to live in, and I promise to you children and grandchildren and ancestors as numerous as the stars in the heaven. Blessing, land, descendants. That's what God promises. But then God says to them, and what I want you to promise to me is that you will entrust your lives to me, which means that you will follow me on any path that I take you. And hearing that, Abraham says to God, well, that sounds like a good promise. But how do we know, God, that you're going to keep your promise to us? That's kind of blunt language, isn't it, to use to God? How do we know, God, that you're going to keep your blessing, your promise to us? Abraham felt that he had some reason to wonder about God and God's promises because years before this, many years before this, God had come to Abraham and Sarah and he had promised them a child. They didn't have any children at all. And God promised them they would have a son born, but they still hadn't had a son born yet. They're getting into their 80s. They're thinking, we're way past the age of having children, but God promised this. So Abraham had some doubts about God, and Abraham says, how do I know you're going to keep your promise? Well, as kind of shockingly blunt and honest as Abraham is actually a role model for us of how God likes it when we're honest with God. God likes it. God wants to have open and honest conversation for us. He wants to hear from us even when we have doubts and questions. People sometimes will say to me as they'll come and they'll talk about kind of their spiritual life, they will sometimes say to me, I have so many questions right now. I just don't know what to believe anymore. And they say, I'm honest, I have doubts about God. I wonder where God is at in my life and what God is doing. It just seems like just bad things are happening. And they say, I don't even feel like I can pray anymore because I don't even know what to say to God. And what I say to them in that situation is, let that be your prayer. If you're in a time of doubts and questions, let your prayer be, Dear God, I have a lot of questions right now. God, I have a lot of doubts right now. God, I can't figure out really what you're doing, or even if I can depend on you. I have to be honest about that. I want to know what you're doing, but God, I just have a lot of doubts right now. God loves honest conversation. God loves hearing from our heart and from our soul and from our mind, because then God knows what's really going on in our lives, and that's the beginning of good conversation with God. And so that's what's going on in our text today, that Abraham very bluntly says to God, God, I want to know that you're going to keep your promise. And so that's at that point God says, okay, let's have a covenant ceremony. Let's have a covenant ceremony in which we promise to each other that we guarantee we're going to keep our promises. And God says, the way we'll get started on that, he says to Abraham, is you get together and bring to me a 3-year-old heifer, a 2-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. And that's what Abraham did. He brought all those animals. And then, as was the custom at the time, they cut all those animals in two. They cut in half the heifer, the goat, the ram, not the birds, because there wouldn't be much left if you cut little birds in two. But they cut them all in half. Why did they do that? In the Hebrew language, you never hear anybody saying that they're going to write a covenant with each other. Like, we will write a promissory note, or we will sign a contract. In Hebrew, what you say is you're going to cut a covenant. In fact, the Hebrew word covenant comes from the word to cut. We still have an echo of that in the English language because we sometimes talk about Well, in Hebrew, what you do is if two parties want to make a pact, they want to make a joint agreement, what they do is they gather animals in the prime of their life and they cut them in two, and then they lay them out, each half on each side of a path. So they have half of a heifer and half of a heifer and then half of a goat, half of a goat. They line up all these animals cut in two, and then they walk, the two people cutting the covenant, walk down the center of this path between the animals that are all cut up, with the understanding that if they don't keep their promise to each other, then they're going to be cut in the same way. They're going to be cut up if they don't keep their promise to each other. So Abraham and God make all these arrangements to have the cut animals all laid out. But the understanding is that they're going to actually walk that path and cut the covenant right when night falls, right when it gets dark. Then, right at the crucial moment, we heard in the lesson, right at the crucial moment, just when night falls, Abraham falls asleep. He falls asleep. The text says that a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. A deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. So Abraham falls asleep. But here's the crucial piece of the lesson. God walks the path alone. God could have looked at what Abraham was doing and saying, okay, Abraham's asleep, the deal's off. But God walks the path alone. God, in the form, it says, of a smoking fire pot and a burning torch. That's what they could see in the dark, but they knew it was God. God walks the path alone. And then God says to Abraham, who's still asleep, to you I will give this land and to all your descendants. From the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, I give this land to you. Now, that's the story. There's three images in that story. There's three pieces of that story that, for me, I think are the most important parts, because that's where we can apply this covenant story, this 4,000-year-old covenant story to our life as well. And the three images are, first of all, the image of Abraham falling asleep. Secondly, the image of God working in the dark to bring a blessing. And thirdly, the image of what I'll call a redemptive sacrifice, of someone risking their own suffering, someone risking to be cut on behalf of another. First, the image of Abraham falling asleep. When you read the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's different ways in which our human predicament is explained. Our human predicament, our human problem, our human struggle, sometimes it's called sin. But it's often pictured in different kinds of ways. Sometimes it's pictured as rebellion. Our predicament, our problem as humans is that we're always rebelling against God. We're trying to go our own way. Sometimes it's described as blindness, that we're blind to God, we're blind to ourselves, we're blind to each other. Sometimes it's described as hardness of heart, that our heart just gets tough and can't let in God's love or let out love for others. There's lots of ways in which our human predicament is pictured. But one of the ways it's pictured in both of the Testaments, including our lesson today, is asleep. The problem is that God creates us. God gives us life, and we fall asleep. Right in the middle of life, we fall asleep. How does that happen? Typically, it's not through a voluntary intention on our part, but sometimes, for example, life is so frantic. Day after day after day, life is so frantic. We sort of grow numb. We sort of fall asleep, like we just can't take it anymore. It's like we're busy doing so many things. It's like after a long, long day, you come home and somebody asks you a question and you can't even answer because your mind just isn't even thinking at that point. Sometimes it's the franticness of life that causes us to go to sleep. Sometimes it's the pain of life. Life gets so complicated, so painful, that we actually choose to anesthetize ourselves. We choose to medicate ourselves just to get away from the pain. Sometimes people will medicate themselves with alcohol.